So we are going to be today and tomorrow. I'm going to have virtual office hours. In other words, you got to probably have a question, just call me or text me, and we'll talk. Friday back to normal. We have to keep moving. I gave this a lot of thought. I know several of you want to keep doing practice things, but that was 310 stuff. Eventually, we have to keep moving to just muscles and function, and you need to do practice on your own, or you need to do, like, in other words, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8:30 shouldn't be the only time you look at this stuff. Does that make sense? And I'm not preaching. I'm just trying to be a good communicator, that we just don't have time to do a joint and then spend 2 days doing practice examples for that joint. We just can't. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get through the knee today. On Friday, I'll do a practice stuff. But moving forward, like we still have to get in the hip, we still have to get in the wrist, we still have to, like, there's so many things that we just can't afford to keep rehashing 310 every time we do another joint. Okay. So what I'm asking is you guys can kind of practice, have old videos. I'll be happy to, on my YouTube channel, I have several 310 videos if you need to. But you remember at the beginning of the semester, I was like, recap on your 310, recap on your 310, recap on your 310. And here we are. So I'm just giving y'all a heads up, guys. We have to keep moving so that we can finish all of the major muscles in the body. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the knee, or the KNES. These are the muscles you're going to be held accountable for. There are a couple little feeble muscles that aren't found in like 7% of the population, like the plantaris and a couple little small ones. So these are just the major ones. All right. I listed you're the first section to ever get this. Like in the past, like students would have to write down what they do. But now I'm going to be a good communicator and make sure we're all on the same page so that there's no misunderstanding about what these muscles do. And what do they do? Pull. And how do they pull? In certain directions of motion. That's it. That's their function. They do it when you're relaxed. They do it when they concentrically contract. They do it when they eccentrically contract, isometrically contract, even when you're stretching. This is how they pull. This is our 1, 2, 3, 4th go at it. So we're clear. This is the prudent information of what you're going to have to know for functional muscles. Some of you are going to cling to that, which is great. I just want you to know what a biceps femoris does at the knee joint. Okay? Some of you may take the cross-sectional approach, and that's also cool. It'll still tell you the function of a biceps femoris. So don't think that you have to, it's just a teaching tool to show function with a spatial relationship of how the muscles cross. The knee is unique. 310 review. It's a modified hinge, meaning that when we flex it, we get a little rotation going. And if you remember from 310, that's so that when we cut and plant, we don't rip up our knee every time we cut and plant. If our knee didn't allow, first of all, you're not going to rotate your knee with your legs straight. That's why you have hip rotation. You don't need hip rotation when your legs are straight. And you're probably not going to cut and plant with your legs straight. Right? But when your knee is flexed and you can compress the ground more than your body weight, interlocking those two surfaces together, optimizing friction forces, when you go to change direction and rotate, that's not hip anymore. The role of the hip is now played by the knee. So we have to give some rotation, give a little some, nice use of English. Right? So when our knee is flexed, we're going to have some muscles, most of our muscles are going to be internal rotators, and one big one is going to be an external rotator. Why do we have so many internal rotators? Well, when you cut and plant, do y'all remember that illusion from 310? You actually externally rotate when you cut and plant. Remember that illusion? So doesn't it make sense that we need a lot of internal pullers to try to prevent the knee from externally rotating too much, or we might rip something and tear something? And that's one of the mechanisms of ACL tears when people do, you'll hear this. I've done that route thousands of times, but on that one route, my knee buckled. It's because those muscles didn't fire to be joint stabilizers. So remember, yes, ligaments stabilize joints, but more than that, your muscles stabilize joints as well, pulling in directions of motion. Okay. So our knee extensors are going to be anterior. You guys know these four, your quad. We're going to talk about those individual muscles today. These muscles are your knee flexors. You guys are familiar with these three superstars, the hamstrings. We're going to talk about those today. These arrows of rotation only count when the knee is flexed. Think of it like this. When your knee is extended, those muscles are going to run very vertical. But when your knee is flexed, it's almost like a tree that went from being upright to laying down, maybe on water, floating on water. You can spin it when it's laying down. So the point of that analogy is that when my knee is extended and those muscles are very vertical, they don't have a spinning component. But when you flex the knee, those same muscles can now spin, pull in the direction of spin. Does that make sense? Okay. For those of you watching from home, I did this. When your knee is extended, those knee muscles are very vertical, very straight. But when you flex your knee, now they can kind of spin the lower leg like a log. Internal rotation pull and external rotation. Who has started or who, well, all I have to say, or what I'm going to try to remind you is that I can understand if you wait until like a day or two before, I can see how this could be overwhelming. So just try to keep up, little bites of the apple, okay? You have the break, try to catch up on it as we do it, okay? And we're going to talk about I'm going to interject some cool things about some of our muscles. Every time I want to put this to remind you of the planes and the axis, right? So you see how for this one, our polar is NA and anatomical, but it's going to, internal and external rotation can happen when the knee is flexed. So I even put that little caveat in there. NA for AP, because we don't want our knee to move in the frontal plane. That would be a bad day. That's when someone lands on the outside of your leg and you have what we call valgus stress. We don't want our knee to move in the frontal plane, right? So that's why AP axis is not applicable because we don't have motion in that plane. So it's all about the bilateral, and then when our knee is flexed, that's when we have some polar. Cool? This ain't water, y'all. Okay. All right, let's start with the quads. So I have a couple generalizational pictures just to show spatial relationships before we get into them individually. But I do want to point out a couple of things. Yes, four muscles. Yes, extension pullers at the knee. A couple things to point out, though, is that all four muscles of the quad is going to blend into one common tendon called the quadriceps tendon that's before it gets to the patella. Those muscles working through that tendon, kind of similar to when we went over the ab muscles, that the tendons kind of serve as a transfer of forces, right? That tendon doesn't stop at the proximal patella and then start a new tendon on the distal. It literally encapsulates the patella and empties on the other side and then inserts on the tibial tuberosity on the tibia. So sometimes people will call like this the patella ligament because it's going from the bone to bone. Nah, dude, like that's part of the tendon from the quad that's just encapsulating the patella on its way to its eventual insertion on the tibia. Does that make sense? Where we call it is location, location, location. I remember at a physiology class at Southern Mississippi, Dr. Webster asked this question, and I was ready for it, man. I don't think he was happy I knew the answer to this. But I only knew it because another teacher had said it, so it was kind of cheating. But he said, what's the difference between blood plasma and interstitial fluid? And I said, Dr. Webster, it's the same stuff, but where it's found in the body gives it a different name. If it's in the blood, it's plasma. If it's in the interstitium, it's interstitial fluid, but it's the same substance. It's similar here. Like it's the same tendon, but where it's located before or after the patella is whether we call it a quad tendon or a patella. Location, location, location. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Another function of the quad, guys, very important for influence of motion, but to keep that patella, to track that patella, to stabilize that patella on its groove, as we're going to see how the patella is going to groove on the femur. Dr. Bob Macklin and the ortho at Auburn, when I was doing my fellowship, he said it's like trying to keep the train on the train track. So you have this patella, and it's the train, and the femoral groove is the track, and you're trying to stabilize that patella in different ways to try to keep it from on the train track, because has anybody ever had a dislocated patella? That's a bad day, right? So your muscles serve as stabilizers, trying to kind of keep that patella in different angles of pull, trying to keep it tight so that it doesn't track off of that femoral groove, okay? Your quads, I like to use this reference: apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. 3 of them are going to be very similar, and they can all have something in common. Then you got the sledgehammer, the one that's different. You're going to have 3 vasti muscles, and super easy. You got one more on the inside, we're going to call that the medial. You got one more on the outside, we're going to call that the lateral, and one in the middle we're going to call the intermediate. Vastus, 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 apple, banana, strawberry, and then we have the rectus femoris, sledgehammer, the one that's different, the one that has something in common, but it crosses the hip and functions at the hip. That's why it gets a different name. And there's precedent all over the body. When we get to the hip, you're going to see adductor magnus, adductor longus, adductor brevis, gracilis. The one that crosses the knee joint doesn't get the same verbiage as the ones that. Okay. Yoink. I also spaced them out. One more on the inside, one more on the outside, one in the middle, and then the one is the one in the middle, and then this is the one that crosses the hip. Also, the one that crosses the hip, look how, remember we talked about pulleys? Like how a muscle can serve as, hey guys, thanks for supporting me. Like holding up my child so I could see a parade better, right? So notice how these vasti muscles, the rectus, can kind of piggyback on top of them and have a better angle of pull, right? It's like, thanks guys, I can see the parade. So I try to give you different views. One more view, rectus. Notice how it crosses the hip in the front without even telling you. What do you think its function at the hip is going to be? Absolutely. It's a hip flexion force. How are we going to stretch it? Extend. I mean, it's all the same stuff. It's the same concepts, just applied to different muscles, bless you, that cross in different ways. But muscles can only pull. Good. What's cool is that medialis more medial. When we get to the hamstrings, the semimembranosus is also the most medial. So that M word kind of comes in handy a couple of times. All right, guys, the quads are going to be super simple because all of them are going to cross the knee in the front. They're all going to be anterior pullers. Thus, they're all going to be knee extensors. What I do want to point out that I think is important is that the quads, because the patella, so the quads are pulling at different angles proximally, medialis, lateralis, but that's to help track the patella, to help keep the patella on the train track. But the tendon that passes through the patella is very up and down, very straight across. And this is what's pulling on the tibia. So in other words, there's no obliquity here. There's no external. So it's not that the medialis has an internal pull or the lateralis. No, because the tendon that's yanking is straight up and down. So all they're going to do is pull in a direction of extension. Does that make sense? That's why on your circle, they're all on the axis and there's no rotational component, because it is the knees version of the soleus and the gastroc, just pulling straight up on the heel bone. That makes sense? Okay. So our rectus, if you go to your list, you're going to see knee extension puller or knee extensor and a hip flexion puller, because it starts on our anterior inferior iliac spine. Do you remember we have our anterior superior, inferior. All of those landmarks get all confusing. So I like to just say it crosses the hip in the front. Right? To me, that's so simple for function. It just crosses the hip in the front. And some of you are going to have to know those things, but not all of us. And that drowns out the important thing, and it's the function. So it crosses the hip in the front. That's why it's going to be a hip flexion puller and a knee extension puller. Anybody ever notice when you're stretching, like if you flex your knee, right, to stretch your quads, if you extend your knee, like the wrath of the Lord comes upon you and like you feel like your muscles are going to rip out? Has anybody ever noticed that? Like putting that hip position, like, whoa, I feel that a lot more. Ta-da, it's your rectus femoris. It's the one that is a hip flexor. So when I extend, I'm going to stretch it at the hip. And then when I flex, I'm going to stretch it at the knee. So it makes sense that if I wanted to isolate or test the rectus, I'd want to position both the knee and the hip. But if I didn't, in other words, I don't get as much knee flexion when I extend my hip, because that one muscle is stopping my range of motion because it's so tight. So if I wanted to maybe check my range of motion or stuff for my vasti muscles, then maybe I'd want to slack my hip muscle and then check my range of motion. Does that just kind of make some functional sense? The vastus medialis. This is crazy stuff, man. So all of these muscles, well, not all, but all the vasti muscles start on the femur. They don't cross into the hip. But notice how crazy, like the femur goes from like medial to lateral, right? We have an angle. In fact, has anybody ever heard of a Q angle? Mostly talked about in women, their Q angles from their hips. Their femurs come in at a steeper angle. Q is for quad. The quad angle, because your quad's going to follow your femur. So that's where that comes from. Okay. So our vastus medialis doesn't cross into the hip, so no hip function. Notice how it still has, yes, it has some obliquity. The vertical component is going to be my knee extension puller. So then you're like, well, what's that medial component? That's trying to help track that patella. Lateral tracking and medial tracking. What's the best way to put this? If you tried to balance something and all you did was put compression on it, has anybody ever done that trick where they try to squeeze their hands together and you knock them off? Has anybody ever done that before? You've seen that trick before? Squeeze your hands together as hard as you can, and then you can come and knock them off. Watch, try mine. I got old man strength. Come on, try hard. I'm cheating. But the point is that if you could put, if all of our force just came vertical, it'd be easy to knock it off. It behooves us to put some side-to-side forces to try to help keep it lined up. Kind of makes sense?
So that's what's holding you together.
It's what the angles of the quads is trying to keep the patella tracking on the femur.
Okay.
Put it this way. Has anybody put your hand on your knee and flex and extend? Do you feel some popping and grinding? Yeah, you weren't born with that. That's from the friction caused by your patella tracking up against your femur. So vastus medialis, vastus intermedius. The analogy for this one would be like, this would kind of be more like soleus, and the rectus would kind of be more like gastroc. Not exactly the same, but very similar, where you have one that's deep and the biarticular muscle is superficial. Kind of like that. Lateralis. This is actually, fun fact, this is actually the strongest of the quad muscles. And they think it's because it doesn't have the angle that the medialis has to pull medially. So it has to compensate by yanking more because it has less of an oblique angle. You may have heard the term VMO, vastus medialis oblique. That's literally the angle of the VMO trying to track the patella medial. So because the lateralis doesn't have that advantage of angle, it has to compensate for it by just pulling with more force. So its component is similar. Its lateral component is similar. Any questions about the quad? 4 muscles in the front, 1 on the outside, inside, in the middle, and the sledgehammer, the rectus on top of them, that crosses the hip to get to the knee. Anybody ever grow up with growing pains? Anybody have like pain on the front of your knee? That's from the insertion of your quad tendon, which happens to be very close to your growth plate. And all being an active child and growing a lot and all that tugging irritates your growth plate. And that can cause some pain. So that's what it is. It's an irritation of the growth plate because your quad tendon is bothering it by yanking close to it. And sometimes it can actually make the bone evolve and grow out because you're literally pulling away from the bone. I had huge, they call it apophysis, but I had some big old knots that they remove that used to be like way out here. And that was literally my quad pulling out part of my tibia. So my growth plate started to grow out instead of up. So I should be about 6'5". All right, guys, let me introduce you to a really cool knee flexor called the sartorius. I think of Biggie when I do this one. Sartorius. The longest muscle in your body. It's a rope strap-like muscle, and it crosses the hip in the front. What do you think that's going to do? It's going to be a hip flexor. Here's where seeing a muscle's origin and insertion can sometimes mess with you. This muscle lives a majority of its life in the front of the leg. But when it comes time to cross the knee, check this out. Look at that. Crosses in the back. It crosses the knee posteriorly. So this is why it's a knee flexor. If you just went off of origin and insertion and didn't have the context of crossing, in fact, the insertion is an area on the tibia we call the pes anserine. Who cares? But if you just went off of origin insertion, it looks like it'd go straight there. They're both in the front. In fact, if we didn't have the context, you'd go, oh, well, that must be a knee extensor. Front to front. Some cool things about the sartorius. So this is the muscle that when you see it with all of its brothers and sisters and cousins, let's see if I have a picture of it. This is the one that looks like it kind of tight wraps. That's what I mean by that. Oh, that's a good picture. You ever seen like bodybuilders and their legs are all shrink wrapped and you kind of see this like muscle that kind of looks like it's setting a border of their quad that kind of wraps around the front? That's the circle. That's the circle. This muscle is really cool because it has a third class, second class kind of function at the hip. In other words, it inserts very far away from the hip. But the type of muscle it is, Brian, don't get into that. Tell them about the cool stuff. Sometimes I just can't help myself. This muscle is sometimes referred to as a tailor's muscle. Tailor is what they used to call people that sew, right? A tailor. Now they have machines to do everything. But think about it. It's a hip flexor. It's a knee flexor. And as I'm going to show you, it's when the knee is bent, it's an internal rotator because it pulls this way. So if you're sewing for hours and hours and you have one leg crossed over the other, it's on slack at the hip. It's in a sling. It's on slack at the knee, double sling. And it has a small degree of external hip. It's just not one of our major external rotators, but we're slacking it at the hip in a second dimension. So that muscle is literally in a sling. And if you do this for a long, long time, when you get out of that sling, it makes sense that muscle is going to be very, very tight. So tailors, people that sewed for long periods of time, sometimes would have very, very tight sartorius muscles because of that position that they put themselves in. Kind of cool. But who cares? What does it do? It's a knee flexor, and it's a knee internal rotator when the knee is flexed. And my job is to show you why, because of how it crosses. Bless you. So look, if you do circles, the circles tell you the function. There's our sartorius, knee flexor, because it crosses the knee in the back. And when the knee is flexed, it's going to have an internal rotation pull of the merry-go-round. Make sense? That is a great view of that posterior crossing. All right, the popliteus. I like to just say popliteus. All right, guys, one of my favorite muscles in the body, this little guy, you know how like it's common for people to root for like the small guy, like Jose Altuve is super popular, because not just because he's a really good baseball player, but he's kind of a tiny dude. We want to root for the underdog. This is my guy right here, man. The popliteus is super cool. This is a posterior view, so I think it's kind of obvious that's going to have a posterior pull, it's going to have a flexion pull. What's not as obvious is the internal rotation pull. Since all of our circles are right and legged, I wanted to show you that because it's like an oblique, because we're going from lateral to medial, that's why it would pull in a direction of internal rotation when the knee is flexed. But the coolest part about this muscle, I'm going to give you a better angle here. When your knees are locked, when your knees are extended, you ever notice like your quads don't get tired when you're standing? Not like if you were doing like a wall squat, right? Because our bodies, when able, we love to let bone rest on bone. Take some pressure off of our non-erectus spinae muscles. So when our knees are extended, they're locked into place so that we don't have to use quad muscles to kind of keep us upright, okay? There is a mechanism that you guys don't have to know for this class, but eventually some of you will, called the screw home mechanism. It's how our knee externally rotates to lock into place. That's why we can't rotate our knee when we're extended. We got to unlock the knee in order to flex it, in order to rotate. When we're extended, we're locked into place. So it makes sense that if our knees lock, something has to unlock. This is the keyhole. This unlocks the knee, and it's super cool. All of our other knee flexors remember we talked about, are very vertical. This one's special though, because it kind of starts on this lateral condyle, which jets out in kind of our Z dimension, like it jets out posteriorly. So it inserts more medially. So it already kind of has this moment, this torque at the knee that those other muscles like the hamstrings and stuff don't have. The popliteus is like when we were in elementary school. Maybe you guys didn't go to a school like that was savage like my school. But me and my friends used to kick each other in the back of the leg when we weren't looking to try to make ourselves fall. No? Like your friend's just standing there and not paying attention. You go behind them and you just jab them in the back of the knee and it makes their knee collapse. That's this muscle. That muscle literally, when you're locked into place, kicks you in the back, not literally, but creates the flexion you need to unlock your knee. Then gravity's trying to flex you, and you can use your quads to let yourself go down, make yourself go up. But when you're fully extended, it's not like you feel your quads kicking in. So what tips the scale to gravity trying to flex you? Pretty cool, huh? So what? For the test, you just have to know it's a knee flexion puller and it's a knee internal rotation puller. However, I think in past classes, when I've emphasized it, I might say, which of our knee flexors unlocks the knee when you're extended? I think that's a fair question to ask. In fact, if I were you, I'd want that question because there's no like tricks. Like it's just, which one is? So let's go back to our circles. For those of you that are circlers, if you're a lister, I already gave you the functions. But if you're a circler, there's our popliteus, knee flexion, internal rotation pull when the knee is flexed, sartorius, flexor, internal rotation pull. We've already had the gastrocnemius. Yes, ma'am.
I know we're not like done covering everything, but do you have any start to finish examples that we can use to like apply?
It's not that it's a bad question, it's just my brain is traffic jam right now. Save that question for at 9:15. Ask me that question. Thank you. Gracilis. Guys, we've got to call these things something. And this is the sledgehammer to our adductors. So you pulled an adductor. You got this family of adductor muscles that we're going to talk about at the hip. And this is the rectus femoris to that group. Vasti, 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 rectus, adductor, adductor, adductor gracilis. Why does it get a special name? Because it ventures somewhere where those others don't. It crosses the knee, so it gets a different name. Okay? I think you guys could see based off of its pull, it's going to have an adduction pull, right? Pulling in the direction of adduction. The knee function, though, from this view, because remember, guys, all of these pictures that you see on a computer are two-dimensional. That's why it's good to see different views. It's hard to see three-dimensional concepts in a two-dimensional image. So I tried to, look at that, how much better it is to see the posterior crossing of that muscle at the knee. You can't see that, in my opinion, here. You have no clue. How does it cross from front to back? So you got to look at it from the side. Does everybody see the posterior crossing of that muscle here? Okay. So it's a muscle that kind of starts on your pubis and goes down and inserts in that little pes anserine area on the tibia. But who cares? To get to where it starts and finishes, it crosses the hip a certain way and it crosses the knee a certain way. And that's what's most important to function. How does it pull is based off of how it's crossed. Okay? So this is going to be a knee flexor and a knee internal rotator. And we see it right here. Knee flexor, knee internal rotator. There is no rhyme or reason other than I tried to separate them like based off of kind of like compartments. Like the popliteus is an unlocker. Gracilis and sartorius are kind of sound alike. And then you have your hamstring and then your gastro. famous hamstrings. They cross the hip in the back. So what do you think they're going to do with the hip? Extension pull. Yeah, absolutely. Extension pullers. But they also cross the knee in the back. Flexion pullers. Right? Knee flexors, hip extensors. The biceps femoris, two-headed. It's a two-headed muscle along the femur. The long head is going to go up into the hip. When we talk about hip function, you'll notice I'm always just going to say biceps femoris, long head. Short head doesn't get up that high, but they blend into one common tendon and they cross the knee in the back and they insert laterally on the outside, more specifically on the head of your fibula. This string right here, that's your biceps femoris. So watch, when my knee is extended, look how vertical. But when I flex it, now it can spin the log on the water and it has an external rotation pull. The medial hamstring muscles thus have an internal rotation pull. Internal, external, internal, external. Make sense? They both have flexion pull. There is, let me go to the membranosus. Remember how I said the membranosus is going to be the most medial? Like the vastus medialis. So the membranosus, the most medial. Your tendinosus is going to be the next in line. Look at it, look at the difference. Not as medial, right? Not as it on the inside. Tendinosus, and then the big daddy, biceps femoris, long and short head. All this stuff is on Moodle. The reason they call it the hamstrings, guys, is because that's how they used to hang pigs, by these really strong, that aren't going to break, that aren't going to rupture strings, and that's how they would hang up those pigs. So they call them the hamstrings. Yeah, what you got?
Okay, so you said the most medial would be the,
Yeah, just know that's just a kind of a trick to try to help remember the names.
okay,
But in terms of function, it doesn't change anything.
okay.
So look, here's your hamstrings: semimembranosus and semitendinosus, the flexion pullers and the internal rotation pullers, and then your best friend, your biceps femoris, your BF, is going to be a knee flexion puller and a lateral external rotation.
So since they can move in two separate, well, one's doing internal rotation, or two of them are doing internal rotation, one's doing external rotation, are they ever moving in different directions?
Verbiage check. It's
So-
not that they're doing the motion, it's that they're pulling in that direction.
Okay,
True? So what's happening is when you use your knee flexors, if I don't want to rotate, I kind of want to cancel out rotation so that way I can just flex, right? So having a lot of internal rotators to compensate with a big, powerful lateral rotator. So yeah, you only have one lateral rotator to cancel out the internal rotation pull, but this is a big horse. It's a big dad.
they're never moving in separate directions, or separately, though, correct? 'Cause it
I
looks-
don't understand your question. Are you saying like, can I flex and extend at the same time? Is that what you're asking?
It's just like in the first picture of the hamstrings, this one on page 16.
Yeah.
It looks like they're connected, but are they ever moving independently to do that internal rotation or the external?
What's connected?
It looks like,
Oh, at the hip. Yeah, well, they all have the same, I think I understand your question now. And if I don't, my apologies. So they have the same origin. So they're gonna have the same kind of pull at the hip. But that's like saying, if, let's say we all had 3 ropes that started from the same place in the corner. But the 3 ropes fanned out to 3 different chairs. So when they're pulling from the same place, but they can influence motion 3 different ways distally further away. So yes, they're all starting together, but one of them is going to go on the outside and 2 of them are going to go on the inside. So that means that the 2 that go to the inside could pull these chairs this way, and the one that goes on the outside could pull the chair that way, even though they start in the same place. They don't have to cause the same motion because their insertions are in different places. We use a polar axis for this one. So the polar axis would be here, and therefore internal or medial rotators would be ones that would pull medially. The biceps femoris is lateral, so it would be a lateral rotator. Think of it like this: if this was the merry-go-round, you would have 2 muscles trying to spin the merry-go-round this way, and 1 muscle would try to spin the merry-go-round that way. That makes sense? So even though they started in the same place at the hip, as they cross the hip, they don't finish in the same place. So if we go to the merry-go-round example, yoink, yoink. So think of it like this. Think of it as all 3 of the hamstrings came out of the same classroom to go out for PE, but when they got to the merry-go-round, they're not trying to spin the merry-go-round the same. So in other words, they were all in the same classroom in the hip lecture, but when they go out for recess, they're not trying to do the same thing. So the semimembranosus and tendinosus, because they cross medially to the merry-go-round, they're going to try to spin this way. And that arrow shows you how they're trying to spin the merry-go-round. The biceps femoris crosses laterally, so it's trying to spin the merry-go-round that way. Is that better?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. No, thank you for clarifying the question.
So they kind of like cancel each other out too.
Exactly. So when you're doing hamstring curls, if you don't want your knee to rotate, it makes sense that if I have some knee flexors that are trying to medially rotate me or internally rotate, I got to cancel that out with something that's trying to laterally or externally rotate me. And if you just look at the numbers, like, whoa, you got like 5 internal rotators and only 1 external rotator. Yeah, but that 1 external rotator is a big head. And technically it's 2 different heads that are blended into 1, but that is a big lateral rotation tendon right there. So that's how they can play that game. But the reason you need so many is it's an insurance policy for hyper excessive external rotation when you cut the plant. If we didn't have those muscles there to help prevent hyper external rotation, we'd rip our knee apart more. In fact, most of the time when people do hurt themselves, it's because those muscles didn't do their job. And a lot of times we make mistakes when we're tired, right? So it makes sense. You know, you're fatigued, you're tired, you go to cut and plant, you've done it a million times, and the internal rotator's like, oh, I forgot to turn on, or I was a little late. It's incredible the amount of processing that's happening in real time. The last one we've had before, the gastrocnemius. Notice it crosses the knee in the back, so it's a knee flex. All right, let me address the can you do example questions. So before we started the lecture today, I said, guys, if we would never finish if we kept doing 310 stuff. We'd never finish. So I would love to do more, but we would not finish if all we did was practice 310 stuff. So what I'm asking you guys to do is watch old lectures, practice stuff on your own. I mean, again, like think about it. If we did practice for the trunk, we did practice for the cervical, we did some practice on the hip, but it's muscles, like it's concentric, eccentric, like it's the same stuff. If you know how the muscle pulls, you stretch it by moving it in the opposite direction of its pull. Like there's no exceptions because muscles don't pull and push. you determine the agonist in an exercise, just like I taught you in 310. Once you identify the agonist, then you just say who's in that group. So I just don't see how we can finish if we kept doing 310 stuff. I don't. So my priority is to teach you guys muscle function, and then you can practice it on your own. I don't mind doing like an end of the week practice, but we would still be on the ankle. Heck, we'd still be on the trunk if we kept doing 310 stuff. So you have to help me. You have to meet me halfway here. You got to do some extra work. If 310, that's why I have a tough time sometimes passing, not everybody, but like because I know it's going to come back up in 415. Guys, we have to understand how contractions work. That's what separates my students from other university students, is understanding how contractions work. Okay?
So if we go through the lectures on our own after class, say that we have our examples, and we bring those to you in office hours, would that be better? Or no?
No, that would probably be worse.
Okay, just making sure.
But what I can do, because now I'm having to reteach 50 different people. What I think would be great is if here's my compromise, because it's a great question, it's a valid question. I have old 310 lectures on my YouTube. And what I might do is do some practice stuff, but it's not part of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday lectures. Does that make sense? That's what I was going to propose, that I can do some practice videos, but they are on top of, that's old material practice that shouldn't substitute us progressing through new joints and new muscles. And you can watch them if you want. You can get that extra practice. But what I don't want you guys to do is say, we have 6 lectures left and he posted 10 lectures for me to watch.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I think that's a fair compromise. I'm still doing more work, but at least I can do it for everybody and not have to do it individually, because I'm just one person.
Right.
I'm trying my best. I really am. All right, we're good? All right, y'all have a good one.